It almost feels like a rite of passage for fighting games to get a unique spin-off once they finally found some level of success. Guilty Gear tried replicating Dynasty Warriors that one time, King of Fighters got that visual novel, rhythm game, and vertical shooter. Dead or Alive has that unsurprisingly yet still shockingly successful thing that they did. There's honestly quite a few spin-offs for fighting games, but probably the most over-the-top and absolutely ambitious of all of them comes from Tekken with its spin-off, Death by Degrees. Calling this game ambitious is not an understatement. The game tries its absolute best to mix in a bunch of ideas into one solid experience. There's Resident Evil styled puzzles and level design, a really unique combat system that uses the analog sticks instead of face buttons, sniper segments, slide puzzle minigames, RPG like leveling systems, the list could go on. Wrap all that up in a doomsday story and you got yourself quite the game. Even though the game did not sell that well or do that best critically either, I personally found myself having an absolute blast with it. But for each thing the game does right, it does another thing wrong. The level design wasn't all that interesting, featuring locales such as the cruise ship, which most of the game takes place in, and then the second half of the game, the prison. Ooh. Which, albeit isn't a very interesting idea for a level, it still ended up being the most enjoyable section of the game with an increased level of verticality and more linear progression. I really enjoy the way that puzzles were woven into the level design. Like for example, the first boss fight takes place in this meat freezer, and near the end of the game you'll have this metal puck that's reactive at certain temperatures, so you know to take it back to the freezer. Or once you find out that these big statues are actually big mech things, you'll hopefully remember where you saw them earlier on. The game does a really good job at rewarding the player for paying attention to the environment around them. I also really like this one bit where you can't make it through a door because the room is filled with toxic gases, but if you just look at the tank that's pumping the room with gas, you can follow the piping there. The game does a pretty good job at making things as clear as possible to the player. Every document that you pick up gives some sort of hint on how to solve a puzzle. Every important item that you run across in the game has this little white glow on it letting you know that it's interactable, and most of the puzzles are pretty logical. There's still the occasional blip here and there where the puzzle might be a little confusing. Like, I'm not sure what hint that I missed out on about blowing a hole in the wall to progress, but that was probably the most confusing moment in the game for me. There was a few times that I did find myself using a walkthrough for this game, but it wasn't for solving the puzzles, it was because I kept getting lost. I didn't know where to go. I noticed a little too late how important it was to read the documents that you find to figure out what's actually going on, or that Nina updates her own notes that lets you know where to go. The in-game map is kinda useless. Occasionally, you'll see what are just basically quest markers on the map, but most of the time there won't be one, so you'll have to remember where things are, or just figure out how to get there on your own. About halfway through the game, it swaps from taking place on a cruise ship to taking place in a prison for about 50% of the game's content, but you'll still eventually come back to the cruise ship for the final arc of the game, and by that time, you'll hardly remember the layout. My feelings on that choice are pretty mixed, I would say. I actually quite like both of the levels, but relying on what you remember about the level 8 hours later just left me feeling confused most of the time. The combat in the game takes an interesting approach where it wants you to flick the right analog stick in the direction of where you want to attack, and it'll be rapidly flicking it over and over to pull off combos. Blocking works in exactly the same way. You'll need to flick the stick in the direction of an attacking enemy, and it makes the combat feel a little strange because you never quite know what Nina will do next. It's all contextual. For the most part, you can rely on attacking 90% of the time, and blocking only seems to be when you get lucky. You still move around with the left stick, but if you flick it in a direction, you can dodge out of the way. Dodging doesn't always feel super reliable though, and I would often just bash the stick over and over again in a single direction, and sometimes Nina would just stand there and jerk in place. Even though it sounds a little convoluted at first, I found myself getting pretty used to how the game works. Even though you can't actually dodge every attack reliably, you can still use the dodge move to do mix-ups like you would in the main Tekken games. Flicking towards an enemy will let you jump over their heads and hit them from behind. Flicking towards a wall makes Nina do a backflip off of it, and if you just flick away from the camera, you might often do a wall run. It actually starts to feel pretty natural after a little bit, and I find it quite a shame that there aren't actually more games using this same system. I enjoy it a lot. You can hold down R1 to do grabs and throws, If you have enough of your focus meter active, you can hold down the left trigger and it puts Nina into this weird X-ray mode where she can break people's bones. It's kinda cool. According to the back of the game's box, not only does Nina use her martial arts skills, but she also gets to wield a variety of weapons, like handguns, sniper rifles, swords, and tonfas. I don't know about you, but I can't think of anything else that would hype up elite gamers like tonfas. I honestly think it's somewhat hilarious seeing Nina throw around a giant sword or blasting enemies with a Spaz 12. Weapons work in the same way as the rest of the combat. You just hold down L1 while you're pointing in the same direction of any enemy. There's this whole upgrade system that I also unfortunately just missed out on during my first playthrough. I don't know how. The combat is already rather fleshed out without it, so it makes for a mostly enjoyable experience even without the upgrades. I guess it would have added more moves allowing you to experiment with different combos. That would have been really nice to have known about when I was playing, but I didn't really mind not having them. The game was still very playable without any of the upgrades. As far as I could tell though, each move was based on Nina's own moveset from the main series. The way the combat works is not always flowers and sunshine though. Unfortunately, most of the problems with the game itself actually comes down to the combat, and its mixture of this Resident Evil style fixed camera system that makes for a somewhat awkward experience. At first glance, this might look something like a first Devil May Cry, but the choices of the camera placement just are not nearly as polished. I know Devil May Cry didn't even have that good of cameras, but this is somehow worse. The camera angle is constantly changing on you, making you think that you're attacking in one direction and suddenly Nina is just punching the air. Sometimes it doesn't change when you're expecting it to, and you'll be fighting off screen the whole time. When you're just walking around, the camera angle changes on you, Nina's controls freak out a little bit. She'll either get stuck running into a wall or do some twitchy movements until she just figures it out. You can let go of the stick and that kind of fixes it, but you have to do this every single time the camera changes, and it changes so often. It just made for a really disorientating experience. The game does try to rectify its own camera system by letting the player hold down the right trigger to lock the camera behind Nina like a third-person action game. But when you're using this action cam, you can't attack. The right stick is now bound to the camera, so you can't do anything. When you let go of the button, there's no way of knowing what camera angle you're going to have next, so suddenly you'll just be kicking in the wrong direction even though the enemy was right there in front of you. The action cam's inclusion into this game just made for a more awkward experience than anything else actually. I kinda prefer just using the regular camera. Even though this isn't a stealth game, they do give the player a handful of these stealth mechanics, such as dodging these laser fields with Splinter Cell goggles, or dodging past spotlights like it's Sly Cooper. You can even sneak up behind someone and snap their neck, but if you use the action cam, you're constantly in a running state, so you'll always be heard before you can sneak up behind anyone. I'm not really sure what made them think that was a good idea, because the game already has a dedicated run button. Why not just let the player use the action cam or the run button whenever they want? I think what actually would have fixed this issue is using a set camera direction like the Metal Gear Solid games do, where the camera is pretty much always pointing in the same direction for the whole room instead of constantly changing angles. I actually do really enjoy fixed cameras when they work right. Yeah, some of us do exist out there, but the implementation of it in this game, it just fails to add any substance. The enemy AI isn't all that great either, but they manage to do some clever things with them. For the most part, they'll swarm at you like enemies from Vampire Survivors. They call in for backup over and over unless you can clear them out quickly, and if they want to use a gun on you, they have to call out for permission to fire, and they will just stand there for a few seconds till they get confirmation on the radio that they can. So you can take advantage of that and knock them down quickly, but if you take your time, they'll start shooting at you. And guns do a lot of damage in this game. The title of the game, Death by Degrees, has a double meaning. It's both in reference to the intuitive 360-degree combat system, but also being the plot of the game, the bad guys wanting to heat up these methane rocks at the bottom of the ocean to basically cause, say it with me, death by degree.
That simplifies things.
The title is just so perfectly early 2000s crazy that it's just so wonderful, but I can't help but to think that it might have added to the lack of sales. Unless you really were a big fan of Tekken and knew it really well, how were you supposed to know this was a Tekken game? If you don't recognize Nina already from the front cover, you wouldn't be remiss for thinking it was just any other Metal Gear clone. If you actually zoom in really closely at the title though, you can see that the full title of the game is actually Tekkens Nina Williams in Death by Degrees. Nothing else on the cover really screams Tekken. If you compare it to something like Shaolin Monks, knowing nothing at all about Mortal Kombat, I still know it's a Mortal Kombat game because it wears the franchise name proudly on the cover. I'm not sure if they were just trying to make the cover more tasteful by not putting Tekken in big letters on the front. Maybe Namco wanted the game to stand out on its own. And the game does a pretty good job at standing out on its own from at least any of the other Tekken games, but it really wears its influences on its sleeve. I already mentioned the overly Resident Evil influence in both the level design and puzzle design, but the visual design just screams Metal Gear. There's similar elements not only in its HUD, but attempting to make larger-than-life villains, mixing up the combat with both melee and projectile weapons, infiltrating and sneaking around enemy bases, using ventilation shafts to get around, all of Nina's cool gadgets, and not to mention these guys. Even though it tries its best to emulate a Metal Gear story, it just doesn't quite meet the mark. The three main bosses in the game don't really have anything too unique about them other than just the way they look. The voice acting isn't bad per se, but it isn't all that good either.
No, there is no escape.
And the game does nothing to amp them up in any meaningful way. Metal Gear has such iconic bosses with how Kojima made them as quirky as possible, and making their fights just as unique, but in Death by Degrees, they're just mostly forgettable.
Sorry to disappoint you, but I prefer guns.
Each boss fight feels like any other enemy in the game except for the extended health bar. Any tension in the fights is basically just thrown out the window by the Skyrim-like healing system where you can just open the menu at any time and scarf down as much food as you need to heal yourself back to max. Food drops pretty frequently too, so you'll never find yourself struggling to get back to full health. I don't know if the difficulty would have affected that at all. I suppose that's something to try on another playthrough. Shockingly, the first boss is really the only one that stood out to me, as your first encounter with them takes place in a freezer, where he runs up and down shooting at you, and then the second encounter takes place in this arena full of spiked walls. It's probably the hardest part of the game too, since you'll be limited on healing supplies, and you'll actually have much less health due to the leveling system. Because you level up, you'll be gaining health throughout the game, which makes the rest of the bosses feel like less of a challenge later on. There is one boss that pits you in this hallucination where you have to defend the child version of Nina from zombies, while also fighting the boss. They reuse that same scenario 3 times, which does make it more memorable, but it really loses the punch that second time around. Speaking of reused bosses, you also have to fight these Metal Gear things 4 times over, and it all just kind of makes for a mundane experience. Nina herself also is not that interesting. She doesn't really say all that much, and when she does get the chance to interact with someone, she's often pretty serious. Nina is a merc for hire working with an agent from MI6 named Alan. They occasionally chatter on the phone or bump into each other throughout the story. When they interact, we see a less serious side of Nina, often showing her kicking up her feet or trying to make a joke here and there.
The name's Alan Smithy.
Not very creative, are we, Mr. Alias Man?
There's also this guy she needs to break out of a prison named Lucas, which is basically just this game's version of the DARPA chief. Pretty much any interaction between these two ends up being as over the top as the game gets. Lucas will freak out over literally everything, so she'll start poking fun at him whenever she gets the chance.
The elevator.
You want me to sneak past the enemy by myself?
Come on, you make this full.
The game wants us to try to take it seriously. It's meant to be somewhat of an origin story for Nina, since all the events of the game do take place before the events of the first Tekken. The only thing really Tekken about the story is just the inclusion of both Heihachi and Anna. You only see Heihachi one time, and when you do, he sends the special Tekken forces in to back up the main trio of enemies. In between all the bosses and exploration, the game does try to break things up in a few ways. There's these sniper segments that, while somewhat enjoyable, often do overstay their welcome and drag on for far too long. All of Nina's cool gadgets, including her fingerprint scanner, which is kind of like the main mechanic of the game. When you're not actively in combat, you'll be using this majority of the time to be scanning fingerprints on objects so you can get around to each room. If you kill a boss or solve a puzzle, you might get a fingerprint that has a different level of access over another fingerprint, so you can unlock more doors. There's moments where you take control of this drone where you can sneak into rooms, use it to solve puzzles, snooping in conversations, opening doors Nina can't quite reach on her own. It's a pretty cool little gimmick. They somehow turned saving into the game into a really big hassle. There's this little radar that will pop up at the top right of the screen and let you know when you're close to a save point, but the save points will be completely invisible until you stand right on top of them. Some of them are even hidden behind a breakable object, which is just really annoying to go find when you're just running around, and it turns out you just have to break a pot in the corner of the room to go save the game. Why? And if you also discover any of these weapon crates or these boxes sprinkled throughout the map, You'll need to play these slide puzzle mini games that just end up being too convoluted for me after a while, so I resorted to the IGN walkthrough. I used this same walkthrough when I found myself getting stuck, like I mentioned earlier, and it's just one of the most unhinged things I have ever read. Using this walkthrough, you'll see such gems as, once the boss is defeated, scan the bitch hole's prints. Take the holster near the wardrobe's exit. Nina will change her clothes. You can't watch. Or my personal favorite, if you can't match the panel to your in-game map, you should not be reproducing with women of Nina Williams' caliber. Please cut your balls off now. Use this walkthrough at your own risk. You know, I really enjoyed the game, and it's sad that we won't ever see a sequel or another game in this style. I really enjoyed Tekken, probably my favorite fighting game series out there. The characters are also unique, the actual story is pretty batshit crazy, and another Tekken game like this wouldn't be all that bad of an idea to me. If you didn't already know, pretty much every Tekken game since the third one at least, had this Tekken Forces mode. It might go by another name in some of the other titles, but it's a really cool beat 'em up side mode that progressively got better as the series went on. I'm not sure if they'll keep doing these modes since the core game really is the main selling point, but Street Fighter 6 added that really fun World Tour mode that I would love to see something like this make a comeback in Tekken 8. At least at the time of writing, nothing has been confirmed about that inclusion, so here's hoping. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for watching. My last video did a lot better than I ever expected, and that got me more excited about making another one. And I feel like I did a much better job this time around, so if you liked what you watched and want to help support me, consider subscribing, sticking around. It would mean a lot to me, and hopefully my next video will be even better.